Welcome to everybody for joining us today. The background to this event is obviously, since COVID happened, we all spent a lot of time talking about the impact of COVID. The social statistics section has had a couple of meetings already, public meetings, and what we've done so far has basically been about the impact of COVID on statistics. And kind of that's missed out is the impact of statistics on COVID. A huge part of the whole government strategy relies on people, following the rules, and that requires understanding and presenting information on the current state of affairs is hugely important in that, and that's why we felt it would be useful to talk about how statistics get presented to the public. Before I talk about the event, the speakers, just a couple of bits of housekeeping, because no one ever reads the notes that are written above and around the screen. Firstly, just to let you all know, the event is being recorded. And secondly, if I could ask everybody other than the presenters to make sure that their cameras are switched off and that their microphones are switched off, because this will just improve the bandwidth. So if you're not actually one of the speakers, please make sure that your camera is turned off and that I think you're already muted, but please turn off your camera because that will help with the bandwidth. And the key thing about today is I need to warn you that you're going to have to do quite a bit of work yourselves, because this is going to be a discussion-heavy meeting rather than a presentation-heavy meeting. We have three speakers who are going to give fairly short presentations. There won't be questions after each presentation. We're going to take questions in one go at the end. If you've got a question that comes up, then you use the chat box to write it down if you want to make sure it's recorded so we can see it and raise it later. And then later on, when we get to the discussion session, use the raise hand button. We have 94 people I see currently in the meeting, so I'm expecting a good number of questions as a result. So, as I said, we have three speakers today. The first is Anthony Masters, who's going to be talking about the theoretical view from the RSS about how statistics should be presented. The RSS has played quite a big role in the COVID. David Spiegelhalter particularly has been very visible, and one of the RSS's roles is advising on how best to present this vast amount of statistics that are out there to the public. And Anthony's going to talk about some general principles. Our second speaker is Robert Cuffe, who is head of statistics at BBC News. We're very grateful to him for finding the time. As you can imagine, he's a very busy man these days. And in fact, he's so busy, he's actually going to nip out for 10 minutes during this session to go and appear on BBC News. So we're particularly grateful to him. And our third speaker is John Burn-Murdoch from the Financial Times, who was recommended to me by many people as probably the journalist who's done the best work at presenting complex statistical information in a way that the Joe public can understand. Because that's really what this session is all about, is how do you take complex information and present it in a way that non-statisticians, and I'm not a statistician by any way, can actually understand it all. So with that done, we'll pass over to Anthony to give the first presentation.
Hello. Thanks, Nick, and thanks to Liz as well for having set up the meeting. Hopefully you can see my slides. The Teams does its thing that it usually does, where it hides the sort of main sort of Teams area, so I can't actually, as it were, see your reaction. So hopefully all is going well. So the goal of this presentation is basically to introduce the challenges of communicating COVID-19 statistics. And so I think there are sort of three major ones. So one is that this is a novel virus that has novel statistics for the public. Challenge two is try to set those numbers in their respective contexts. And also three is that there's often quite limited space for explanations. And at the end, there should be a short guide for setting out statistical communication. So, so I think in a 2020, certainly I was thinking that, oh, I should learn more R, I should be more based in statistics, and I should definitely work from home a bit more. And then something happened. So there was a novel coronavirus which was spreading throughout the world. It then got labelled SARS-CoV-2, giving the world a worse sequel than Highlander 2. And there were a lot of numbers. So there was public dashboards springing up. Governments were holding press briefings, and this was a pandemic in the big data era. So what's the first main challenge? It's that this is a new virus and there are new statistics. Now, epidemiology is hard. It's also quite hard to spell and pronounce, which is why a lot of its researchers may refer to it as epi. And actually understanding a pandemic means having knowledge of many different fields. So, for instance, you need to understand public health surveillance, so things like cases, confirmed deaths, hospitalizations, that sort of thing. There's diagnostic testing, which has false negative and false positive rates. You have disease modeling, so you might, for instance, see outputs of, say, stochastic models of disease dynamics, which then give projected deaths under different scenarios. There are things like it's very important things like the reproduction number, which come about from modeling the disease's spread. There are things like, there's a whole raft of different observational studies and systematic errors they produce, as opposed to having randomized control trials. You need to know things about viruses and virology. So, for instance, mutations and the information that we can get from genomic sequencing. And there are also vaccines and immunology as well. So that's about understanding the different types of immune responses, and also things about vaccines as in estimating efficacy and effectiveness, which are different concepts. Now, with a lot of new statistics coming about, you end up with some common misunderstandings. So, for instance, you might certainly have seen in the news like day confirmed COVID-19 cases. So that actually means new people with a positive test reported in the last 24-hour period. Now, you don't test everyone, so that's not all cases, and also there are reporting delays. And in England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, there are daily confirmed COVID-19 tests. So that means deaths within 28 days of positive tests from any cause, which are reported in the last 24-hour period. To say again that there are reporting delays, which means that the number of confirmed deaths is not the number of people who have died from COVID-19 in the last 24 hours. I still see that in some news articles and on social media and so on. The 28-day window is arbitrary. There are obviously different reasons why you might want to pick a longer or shorter period. And it's not death certificates. So this is about dying within a set number of days of a positive test. It's not about saying this disease was the underlying cause or a contributory factor to someone's death. And there's also a figure called the case fatality rate, which is simply the number of confirmed deaths divided by the number of confirmed cases. The main limitation of that is that it's not the infection fatality rate. So it's not, as it were, the number of deaths from total infections. And also because you're missing those cases, but you're also missing some of the deaths as well due to vice exclusion, which means that some people who are infected now may yet go on to die, but those people are not included in a sort of snapshot of the case fatality rate. And you would have to do some modeling in order to, as it were, adjust that estimate. And there are a lot of dangers of new statistics. So one of these is kind of, I guess, strange definitions. Now, this was a graph from one of the day press conferences where the Health Secretary proclaimed that they met their goal on the number of tests performed. I'm not going to do a Matt Hancock impression. That would grade us both. It was a declaration that the number of tests done yesterday was 122,347. And of course, the story here is that, are you meant to be looking at the number of tests and isn't it going up? That was quite unusual. So viruses we might expect in their opening phases to demonstrate exponential growth. Viral testing, not so much. And if you look at the small text under the graph, you will see that they included not only the tests that were processed at the time, but I think for some administrative reason also counted the tests that had been sent out to individuals and not yet processed. So basically those were put in say the post, and those were classed as a test done at that point. And it took until about July for the number of tests processed on that day to finally be published, which was about 83,000. The second big challenge is setting those numbers in context. So what are you comparing against? Now, for confirmed cases or deaths, as I think John will show you in some graphs, a common sort of baseline would be other countries, and also there are against the past or like our expectations of how many cases there should be. So like as in this number of cases down as a rolling average versus what it was 7 days ago. Occasionally see some people comparing cases from one day to the next, ignoring the sort of the weekly cycle that we see as infection fatality rates. So you may want to compare that against other diseases such as the flu, or you may want to compare it in between age groups. Like so, as in what is the risk of death from infection? If you were aged 18 to 24 versus if you were aged over 18, say. And sort of a sort of more recent example that's come out is about adverse events in vaccines. Like so, it's coming out from the European Medicines Agency, was that there was a very rare type of blood clot which was having its risk increased from the AstraZeneca vaccine, and it's about trying to communicate actually. Okay, well, it's still, it may have been like less than 1 in a million to start with. Now it's going to be, a bit higher than that. And what are the acceptable thresholds like versus, say, other drugs where we accept certain risk factors from taking it because the benefit is, because the benefits outweigh those risks. And a sort of a major difficulty in setting those numbers in context is that, unlike, say, labour market statistics, there are no standard definitions. So this is taken from a European Centre of Disease Control and Prevention table from their collation of surveillance in different European countries. So you can see, like, for instance, Belgium, Hungary, and Ireland all have different definitions of what a COVID-19 death is. And the third major challenge would be limited space for explanations. So, as I mentioned, Rob will tell you about that. That doesn't just mean the kind of space on a web page or in a news article, but can also mean like time in a news broadcast and so on. And and part of this challenge is that there are a lot of different types of numbers. Like, so you have administrative counts, like, so as in, well, what system is that coming from? What do you have other systems that you can compare that against? How do you define that count? What might be missing? And then there are survey estimates such as the ONS infection survey, but what is that measuring? In that case, that's measuring swab positivity under a polymerase chain reaction test. What's the sampling frame mode? So those are in-person interviews from the postal address file, which is excluding things like hostels and care homes. And there are also uncertainties from the sampling, but also from the test itself. And there are non-sampling issues such as, as I say, like institutional settings being excluded. And there are also model outputs, which also get called estimates, which, as in, okay, what are the model inputs? What are you trying to estimate? Is it a prediction? Is it a scenario? What's the uncertainty? How sensitive is that model to changes in the inputs and so on? So as part of the work I'm doing, I and the other ambassadors wrote together a guide about trying to interpret COVID-19 numbers in April. I've also been writing weekly stats uncovered articles with David Spiegelhalter, and these articles are really quite short, and that helps refine that skill of trying to explain statistical concepts well within a short time frame. So lastly, a very short guide. This is in no way comprehensive, but you should really say what your numbers mean and trying to avoid jargon. You should be upfront about what the key limitations with statistics that you're quoting are. You should say what the uncertainty is. There's nothing wrong, I think, with saying plausible ranges of the different values. I think that's very helpful for getting people to understand, because some people tend to be quite dismissive when they say the word estimate. There are also different comparisons that you can make. So as in, like if the figure is being estimated through, say, some modeling exercise, then making people aware that different methods can come to different estimates, and also comparing against the past and so on. And there's also data visualization. So as John will talk about, graphs are very powerful for showing that context. And yes, and that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Without further ado, let's go straight on to Robert, because I know he has a deadline.
Of course. Can you hear and see me?
Yep.
Okay. So Anthony said it all. I'm going to focus on just one or two key elements. I want to start off with this example, which is very dear to my heart. It's Ireland's victory over Germany in the European Championships qualifying campaign of 2015. A glorious goal by Shane Long, and a very happy victory, as you can see, made not just those there very happy, me as well. And it was news. It was definitely news, but it wasn't necessarily a robust and detailed summary of the relative effectiveness of both football teams as match-winning machines. In fact, this is the only audience in which I can get away with this guy, because I'm not sure that there is the analysis method that enables you to look properly at a table this sparse. It's news precisely because it's not, because it's surprising, because it's a David versus Goliath story. It's news because it's incredibly important to, particularly to Irish expats like me. It means a lot. And that's one thing that I think as statisticians, we sometimes have to change our perspective when we're thinking about news. And the most helpful sentence that's been said to me by somebody in the newsroom when thinking, is this a news story, as opposed to something very important and very useful information, is, would you shout it upstairs to your mum or to your dad? So is it good enough? Does it meet that level of excitement that you would run out of the kitchen and start yelling at them up the stairs? And that conveys two things. Firstly, it conveys how interesting it has to be, or how exciting, because we know more than ever in news, they don't have to read you. They don't have to watch you or listen to you. And even when they nominally are, they're not really. If they're watching breakfast, they're actually fighting with their kids. If they're on their phone, they're not just looking at different stories on the BBC News website, but they could be going to the sidebar of shame on the Mail, which is, very interesting and very competitive. And all the news aggregators make that competition even more severe. So one, is it exciting? Is it news? And number two is, it sets the budget that Anthony was talking about a couple of seconds ago. If you're going to explain the caveats or the technicalities or the jargon, well, how much time do you have to do it? if you're standing at the bottom of the stairs. I'm not saying that every news story reduces just to a headline. That's not the case. Headlines are particularly short, but you got to be pretty speedy with those big important caveats and how they change the story. I'm going to give you, and my job essentially, that I was told on day 2 when I arrived, was to help teams with this. What are the caveats for this story and the numbers that support the story that we want to run, the top line or the headline we want to run? And can we say the sentence that we want to say? Can we run it in the way that we want to describe? Or are we going to have to do it differently? And how prominent should those caveats be? Do they need to be in the first 4 paragraphs, for example, of the online story, which is a standard to which we hold ourselves in the Beeb, that we get the main info in there in the first 4? Or is it something you can stick down in the methods at the bottom of the article, which you kind of know, and we have data to show no one actually reads? So I'm going to give you one worked example to show you how that happens. So this is an audience that's fairly happy, I think, with the idea of excess mortality and why all-cause mortality is important to look at. One example here, the red areas in these charts are the height of the chart is the deaths in a given week in the country. The red area are excess deaths that were marked as due to COVID according to whatever the national definition was. And then the blue areas in the charts are the excess deaths that weren't marked in the same way. And it's very clear that, Belgium was catching most of it, Peru wasn't. And one of the reasons why we have to be so suspicious of the daily number of COVID deaths that we hear, and why it's important to look at all-cause mortality. Now, in the early stages of what's now the early stages of the pandemic, in May and June last year, it was becoming very clear that the UK was having a terrible, terrible, terrible spring, and there was some debate in the media around what conclusions can we draw, what differences can we say are real and are not real, and when should we wait before we can do the after the pandemic all-cause age-adjusted comparisons. Now, we wanted to get into that a bit early, but the question then becomes, given the sponginess of the daily data, how do you do it? What's the top line that you can write? So you start off, because you do want to get into the area, you do want to show, and you can do that classic journalistic trick of, the question. So is the UK the worst? Or how does the UK's death toll compare with other countries? And that enables you to run the story, to show the charts that, from my perspective, make it screamingly obvious that the UK was having a very, very, very different experience to countries like Denmark or Germany or Norway, without necessarily needing to say the worst. We are the worst. So that's one trick. The question, it's a bit better, but it's still a little bit soft. It's still a little bit weak. You can use kind of fudge words. So not say the UK is the worst, even though you think it might be. You can say it's in an unhappy club. And that's how you get these kind of almost cliches of journalism, where you find a form of words that addresses all these concerns. It hints at the idea that the UK is doing terribly without needing to run the story super strong, and enables you to continue to talk about this interesting area and idea. And what makes journalists, I think, so fascinating to work with is their creativity in finding ways to find a top line, to find a story that people will want to talk about at work or to shout up the stairs. So looking for other elements. And I think John and the team at the FT have done phenomenally on this, not just in the just the gorgeousness and the comprehensiveness with which they've presented the data through the year, but also kind of the ways that they've explored it and looked at it. One that we did was kind of quantifying, how many people have been missed by the death tolls, or the daily death tolls, and that was an analysis we did kind of towards the end of June last year. Specifically with the UK comparison, we started off with the questions, how does it compare? I think the FT called us worst probably a little bit sooner than we did. I think we reported that on telly. I don't think we did it online. And then when we started to get a couple of analyses, cutting it a couple of different ways, we started to write up the UK as the hardest hit, but within very specific comparisons. So tweaking the story, not the worst in the world, but the worst in the G7. Now, G7 doesn't include Spain. So you wait until you get to the ONS analysis last June that was age-adjusted all-cause mortality, that showed England was the highest in about 30 European countries that they looked at. So we slowly stiffened up the story, stiffened up the top line, as the data got stronger and stronger and stronger. And that's kind of the game I play, or that's what I do most of my time at work, is that what's the most grabby thing you can write with the data you've got? And of course, those data have since changed by the end of the year. Just due diligence here, the UK is no longer in that position anymore. It's probably one of the top worst quarter in Europe. But we've seen a pretty terrible first wave in places like Poland and Bulgaria. Right, so that's roughly what the game is. I think non-journalists, and I'm not a journalist. I've been working in news for a couple of years. Sometimes have this view of journalists as these functionally innumerate people who are all arts graduates, and advertising material like this probably doesn't do some people any favors. But there's a bit of a danger for us as statisticians in this world. I give you the example of Miriam Mirzakhani, who was the first woman to win the Fields Medal. She didn't want to do any media, but The Guardian managed to track her down. And they asked her this question. I'll just let you read it for a sec. Now, she's doing her best. Like I said, she wasn't, media trained. This wasn't the thing that she wanted to do. But it is remarkable to me how quickly that goes above my head. And I think we all forget what we know. We're all surprised by how little graduates know when they come for their first interview and how little they're learning in college. We think that significance is a pretty straightforward concept, and it's not. It's too much for most people, and I certainly wouldn't, if I need to shout that up the stairs, that 5-minute explanation of what it means before I start telling the story, maybe I need to find another way to tell the story. So the language that we're very familiar with, and particularly the innate skills we have, or the propensity to not just be happy with numbers, but not to be scared of them, makes us forget that people are sometimes just scared of percentage changes, of compound growth. All those things that are just so intuitive and obvious to us are the things that we help people through to get to that basic question of, is this a big number? I'll do very quickly. So we don't want to be in that position, kind of looking down on Ronnie Corbett and looking up at John Cleese. I think the aim is to try and looking down on the journalists and looking up at the mathematicians. I think the aim is to recognize the phenomenal skills and creativity that journalists bring, and then how do we get our language or our often superior understanding of the nuances through to a lay audience, if they're the people we're trying to get? How do we work with journalists? I think the bacon example that you've heard many people do is great. The 70 grams, a 3 bacon sandwich every day increases your risk of colorectal cancer by 18%. The analysis that Kevin McConway did in The World at One the day after this study came out was brilliant, when he said, well, baseline risk about 6%, 18% of that brings it up to 7. So if you force feed 100 people a bacon sandwich, one of them is going to get colorectal cancer. And that's wrong. And that's just wrong, because that's a comparison of exposed to unexposed, not a comparison against the population average of consumption of processed meats, right? So it's probably exaggerating the size of the effect. But it's much more helpful. It's much more helpful than something that is technically correct. It's just a quick and dirty analysis that really, really helps tell the story in a way that people will understand. If you gave everyone a bacon sandwich every day, probably there'd be one extra case of cancer per 100 people. That's really easy to grasp. That's what's super helpful. And that's when statisticians can be so good at cutting through the numbers and helping people to understand what's really going on. So if you're thinking about where are the areas where I should prioritize my energy on the statistical elements of any press release or a research story, it's on these areas. What are the caveats? What's the main story? And do we need to tell that a little differently? And how prominent should the caveats be? All seen through the lens of, would you shout it up the stairs? Right, that's me.
Thank you very much indeed, Robert. Great, a great start. Always be good to be reminded of classic goals like that. So, and thanks so much again for giving us a. Particularly, Robert's going to disappear and come back. And generally speaking, for everybody, if you have got questions that have come to you already, do write them in the chat, because then we'll make sure that we get to them, and you'll have the chance to raise your hand later. If it's already a question that's already occurred to you, then do please write it down in the chat. I've got a couple of questions that have come through already. So on to our third speaker, John Burn-Murdoch from the Financial Times.
Excellent. So I'll just start off with a very quick something that caught my eye out of Robert's slides there. When Robert was talking about how careful he and the BBC are about when you can say a certain thing and when you can't. He mentioned the example of the excess deaths and whether the UK was the worst in the world. And when the Financial Times came out with that pronouncement, and it's Robert will, I suspect he's now on air, but would otherwise be amused to hear that in going early with that line at the FT, we actually did expose ourselves to the fact that Spain then, I think between the time that we sent our story to print and the time that it appeared on newsstands, Spain revised its all-cause mortality upwards by quite substantially, putting the UK back into second. So I think in doing so, making our sort of fanfare that the UK was the worst look rather foolish. So I think excellent support there for what Robert was saying about really being careful and not saying this stuff until you really, really know you should and can. But yeah, so sorry, moving on to what I want to talk about more broadly about how the FT does this stuff. First of all, I think Anthony and Robert's presentations, they were both absolutely fantastic. I'm going to focus on what they've both touched upon, but which is this key role of being communicators, and the fact that it doesn't really matter how high quality, how precise, how methodologically sound your work has been if people don't understand it, if people simply, as in the example there that Robert put on screen, if it's perhaps just too technical and you're blinding people with science, or if you've communicated something which is clear but in some way misleading. And that's really the core thing we focus on at the FT. So a lot of the work that I do and that we do at the FT uses charts. It's, we do a hell of a lot of work alongside making charts, but charts are often prominent in the way that we present the findings of what we've done. And something that I'm always surprised by how relatively few chart makers, shall we say, I think really think about this, which is you've really got to think about how your audience is going to consume the information that you're putting in front of them in graphical format. And I think a bit like both previous presenters were saying, how all of us on this call today are familiar to greater or lesser degrees with statistics, with charts, with numbers, but that is absolutely not true of the majority of the population. Most people, in my experience at least, not myself, but most people drop maths as soon as they can at school. That's completely foreign to me, having grown up with maths as my strongest subject and my dad as a maths teacher, but it's true of a hell of a lot of people, and they might not have seen charts since they were 16 years old or since they were last looking at textbooks. And so I think we really need to work very hard to make sure we're presenting the information that people like that need and want and are comfortable with, and not the information that people like us who make charts or are very familiar with seeing charts are more used to. And I'm going to point here to there's a scientific paper that really drives a lot of the work that we do at the FT, which was a study where they tried to get to exactly this question, and they put a series of hundreds of charts in front of thousands of study participants and gave people about 10 seconds each to look at a chart and get as much information from it as possible. And what I'm going to show you in a second is an animation showing where people's eyes went when they were looking at a chart. So there's going to be a blue dot showing where people's eyes focus when they are presented with a chart. And what you see is the focus goes straight up to the title of a chart, in this case a chart looking at the most read books in the world, and then comes down and looks at the actual content of the graphic. Now I'm just going to let this play on a loop again. So when someone sees a chart, they go straight to the title, they read the title, then they come down and they look at the other bits and pieces. And what the study found was not only is it that people's attention goes to the title first, but when people were then subsequently asked to summarize what a chart contained, they mentioned things like the title and annotations much, much, much more in terms of what stuck out to them and what led them to remember these charts. They mentioned those much more than any of the actual visual components. Now, obviously, as someone who makes a lot of charts, I'm not going to say, therefore, why bother with charts when you can just write titles? But that's really emphasized how important text is in getting getting a meaning and a message across from a chart to a mass audience. And so I want to show you how we use that kind of information at the FT. So this was sort of version 0.0 of what became our coronavirus trajectory tracker charts, the first of which was published around March the 11th last year. So this initially came out of an email that one of my colleagues sent to me asking what the latest situation was in Europe and other countries relative to Italy, which at the time was sort of the epicenter. And this was the sort of the structure of the chart, the geometry of the chart that I threw together. So you've got along the x-axis from left to right, the number of days since the country had its 100th case. So that being a rough idea of since the country's outbreak really took off. Because of course, if you start at the first case, you're much more reliant on testing, whereas after 100 cases, it's probable that you've got something really happening there. And then vertically, we've got the now sort of famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, logarithmic y-axis of the total number of cases to that point. But the point is, although the geometry of this chart has never changed, we still use broadly the same thing now as we did a year ago. The chart right here is incredibly Spartan and incredibly sterile. There's nothing really to draw you in. There's not much going on here that would get you sort of starting a conversation around this. It certainly wouldn't get you sort of sharing it with quote unquote non-chart people. So where Robert's line was, would you shout this upstairs to mum and dad? The line we often use at the FT, and this is a line that our editors use towards us as journalists, is would your mum or dad understand this chart? And again, in my case with a math teacher dad, I'd say yes, but that's not really the point. The point is there are a lot of people who would look at this and just see shapes and lines and not really know what's going on. So what we do at the FT is two things. So first of all, this version is simply the FT version of the chart. So on our famous pink background and with a few bits of wording on there. But still at this stage, if someone is presented with this chart, they've got to do a lot of working out. They've got to do a lot of head scratching and navigating around this plot to see what's going on. And the thing that changes that is this, which is putting on a title which actually tells you, here's what's going on, here's the takeaway message you should leave this chart with, and also adding things like these annotations on the chart so people who are interested in, okay, why, for example, did these East Asian countries seem to be faring better? There's some annotations there that they can dig into and come away with a more nuanced understanding of what's going on. And it's this text that really makes these charts take off and cut through to an enormous audience. Other people had been producing essentially exactly this same chart in those early March days, but it was the messaging around the charts that we've done at the FT that I think has really helped them take off. So the lesson there is that text and annotation add enormous value for non-chart people. And again, non-chart people is the majority of people in the world. And it can tell someone what message they should take away so that once they understand the message, they can then more easily navigate the rest of the chart. However, we did get a lot of questions like this, asking about that logarithmic y-axis, again, demonstrating that not everyone out here is a mathematician or statistician. So some people were completely confused. They have no idea what's going on. Some people, maybe they knew it was a log axis, but they didn't really understand why we were using that. And, you could say, well, that's a disaster. I've confused people. I've lost people. They're going away with this, thinking that maybe I'm trying to mislead or something like that. But the great thing about social media, and this doesn't only apply to social media, but the great thing is you can present other information to help avoid people coming to those conclusions. So I wrote a couple of threads on Twitter explaining why we'd chosen to use a logarithmic y-axis there and explaining what it is. We ended up at the FT doing a video version of this where I was explaining all of the decision-making that went into that chart. And what that meant is every time that I was then publishing the daily update of these numbers, I was able to, in situ, point to the explanation for why does this chart look like it is, look like it does, why are we using a log y-axis, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that means you see this, you see other people, other members of the public actually saying to sort of correcting other people on Twitter saying, don't worry, it's a log scale, they're common. There's actually a short video explainer here. So clear evidence that people were taking this on board, were understanding it, and were then sort of spreading the good news, as it were, about log scales and why they were appropriate here. And all of that actually led to my favorite chart of the whole pandemic, which is this. I don't know if people are familiar with Google Trends, but this is a tool on Google which lets you see how frequent the search volume for specific terms over time. And what we see here is that search interest in logarithmic scale peaked in March and early April of 2020, which was exactly the time that we at the FT and a few others started publishing these charts. And indeed, the week that we published this chart for the first time at the FT, and millions of people were then seeing that every day, was when that search interest went through the roof. So a clear suggestion, at least, I'm not going to say it's evidence, but it strongly suggests that by familiarizing people with something, with a new statistical or visual technique, but then crucially actually explaining it to them, not just leaving them to sort of go off and scratch their head, you really can educate your audience. So the lesson there, if people are confused by your chart, that is your responsibility. It's not their fault for not getting it. Maybe you've used a technique they're not familiar with. Maybe the whole way that you've laid out your chart is just a bit too much for them to get their head around. And so do take the opportunity to explain wherever your chart has appeared. That's where you should do the explanation of what it really shows. However, there were also some more surprising reactions to this, not just people confused about what a log scale was or why we were using it, but people who actually felt like this was almost making some kind of political point. There was a sense that as the growth rates actually tapered off from the exponential and the growth rate began decreasing, there was a sense that we were implying that the situation was somehow getting better when it perhaps wasn't. You know, there were still growing numbers of cases and deaths as the days went on. And so some people felt that this was almost we were almost sort of lessening the impact of what was really going on. And the lesson for us there, I think, is that even though we on this call today might think of maths, stats, and data visualization as being objective and scientific and you know, and all about precision and accuracy, a lot of people will still read into them sort of political or other judgments, and they will consume them much as they consume text as perhaps having an opinion and agenda. And so that's something we really need to bear in mind when we're making our decisions about how we make our charts. And the final point is, again, on this theme of communication, I think whether it is using social media, whether it is doing like Anthony and Sir David have been doing with their Guardian articles, whatever format it is, we've never had a better opportunity as statisticians, mathematicians, data visualization practitioners to constantly keep this communication going with our audiences in such a way that they don't feel that they're being talked at or talked down to, but that they can actually keep this dialogue going with us so that both they learn more and we learn more about where we should be better communicators. So what we did at the FT was we actually set up a new email address specifically for people who had questions, comments, suggestions, or tips around what we were doing with coronavirus data. And this is just a sample of one day back in April when we had more than 100 messages coming in per day with people talking to us about these charts, some critical, some thanking us, some offering us data or suggestions of what we should do next. And the lesson there again is that we shouldn't just be in the habit of publishing something and then walking away. If we do that, some people are going to get it, you know, thumbs up, fine, but a hell of a lot of people aren't going to get it. And you run the risk of reinforcing the idea that some people have that maths is not for them. Whereas if we keep communicating, if we tell people, here's where you can reach us if you have any questions, do chat to us, and then we make sure that we reply to them, you really allow far, far, far more people, millions of people in this case, to realize that maybe charts and maths and stats are a language that they can speak as well. So that's all I wanted to get through, and I am now looking forward to hearing everyone's questions about all the presentations.
Okay, thank you very much, John. Could I ask our speakers to turn their cameras back on, so for join the discussion phase? And I've had a couple of questions come through already, so we'll deal with those first, and then I'll throw it open for people to raise their hands. So the first question has come from Mr. N. Moon from St. Albans, who's interested in the question of whether we give sort of too much detail about some things and not enough about other things quite often. And what spurred it was listening. I get quite a bit of my news from the radio, and I was hearing these, you know, daily. Today there have been, you know, X 1,273 new cases, and there have been 674 deaths today. And I think, well, that's, yeah, okay. but is that more than yesterday, or was it going up from last week, or is it going down from last month? And so it's the question of when should we be giving trends, and when a single number is useful. I know Robert has volunteered to take this one, so I'll give it to him first, then ask the others to come in.
Just phenomenal interest, daily interest in the number that you hear every day, and you can't get away from that. So people want to know what it is. So the argument then becomes, what information do you give along with that? In an ideal world, you'll give the change in that long-term average, as you say, compared to the month. I think, this audience would know, there's a huge issue with giving today compared to yesterday. But in a breaking news context, so in that first flash alert that goes out on an app, or that goes on a TV channel or on Radio 5 Live, you're not going to get two people independently to look at the 7-day average and compare to where it was a week ago. So you use shortcuts. You compare today to today last week, and you hope that roughly smooths out as much as you can of the bounces and makes the bigger trends more obvious. But it's not something that we get perfect every time, for sure. But there's no denying you're in a situation where you do need to talk about that number, and it's about what context you provide around it.
Thank you for that. John, Anthony, do you want to add to that? John's nodding. So
well, yeah, no, I mean, completely agree. And I think that point of comparing to the same day in the previous week is exactly the way you do it, because the moment you mention a 7-day rolling average, you've probably lost a certain proportion of your audience. It's crazy that that's true, but it is. But by saying, well, for example, like, we know cases are always higher on a Wednesday or a Tuesday, and so here's what it was last Tuesday, Wednesday. I think that's exactly the sort of smart but still accessible way to go about it. Yeah.
Okay, Anthony.
As both Rob and John have said, it's often about sort of, I guess, budget of time and space about giving information, because people want that daily update. But also, you probably should be communicating, say, change in the 7-day average versus the last week and so on. Just to say, is that going up or down?
Okay, thank you. The very first question we had was from Tom King, who I think is volunteering to set up a whole new RSS stats group for digital journalism. So I think we might park that for the moment. People who are interested, do please get in touch with Tom. I've paraphrased slightly a question from Charles Lound, who's making an interesting and kind of contradictory almost point to the point that people don't understand stuff. He makes the point that, say, some discussions around measurement and uncertainty in particular have been quite sophisticated, and I think you guys have played a huge part in getting that discussion going. And he raises the question of the fact there are clearly quite a lot of lay people out there who can engage in sophisticated discussion about uncertainty and so on. The question then arises: do we actually underestimate the public when we're presenting official statistics? Robert, yeah.
There's enormous appetite for this stuff, and a surprising appetite, I think, for the level of sophistication. Probably John is maybe best to talk to this, because I think the stuff that you present on the FT is sometimes very, very sophisticated, and I think you've been surprised by the reach. Yeah.
I mean, and this is one of the tricky things, right? I think some of the time it's not so much aptitude; it's sort of attention, and how much time, and whether people want to dive into something. And absolutely, I think one of the things we'll all have seen over the last year is there are loads of people online who have really interesting questions about how do we know X and how can we be sure about Y. But so I think it's about two things here, right? I think we need to make sure our stuff is sufficiently accessible and clear that people who are time short, or just got too much other stuff going on in their lives, can get to it. But we should never be dumbing down. And certainly, if anyone comes to us with questions that are more nuanced, we should, of course, be absolutely willing to go into that. And both of you also made the point about the need to convey uncertainty. The problem, of course, if we don't do that, is that someone then turns around a week later and says, well, you said the number was this, and actually it was like 0.5% higher than that. So when it comes to things like vaccine efficacy, making it clear that these numbers are not absolute ground truths, there is a range around them, I think is really important. So yes, I think absolutely present enough information that people don't feel that they're being dumbed down to, but don't pile it all in there on the assumption that everyone is going to be like the handful of people who are maybe in our inboxes with interesting questions every day.
It's essentially giving people a choice, isn't it?
Yeah.
They want more, make it available, but don't wad it down everyone's throat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the advantage of like particularly like news websites and things like that, where you can link to like shorter articles explaining certain concepts. So as in like, for instance, the main article, you can explain that there's uncertainty around a vaccine efficacy estimate. You can then explain Cox proportional hazard model somewhere else, not rather than in the main body, and it's about being sort of upfront with that uncertainty. I think if you can lead to overconfidence if you just give those interest rates and go, you've got that sort of slightly strange situation with like pharmaceutical company press releases going, our vaccine is 94.5% effective, rather than just round it, guys. Like that. There's so much uncertainty around that figure that you can't. Putting it to the decimal place is perhaps overdoing it.
Yeah, round it, guys. A point very dear to my heart from my days of political polling. I'm going to read out the next question entirely because can't attempt to paraphrase it, from Robert Whitehead. We heard a lot about how the UK in 2020 had the highest excess deaths since 1918. This was widely covered in the news using age standard mortality rates. However, 2008 before were consistently higher. Crude mortality rates showed that 2003 and before were consistently higher. All these are correct, but speak to different statistical measures. Does this matter when communicating the figures to the public? Is one piece of information enough without the others?
I'll take it. I did that one on the 1 o'clock that day. It's a story, right? Highest one-year bump in deaths since 1945. That's a story. That doesn't mean our living standards are back where they were in 1945, or our life expectancy is backward in 1945. That's a different thing, and that's not what the story was trying to do. So you need to be clear about what you're saying, but there's no doubt that that's a story worth covering, but you need to put in the context that how far it moves us back. Just like if we see a 6 or 8% fall in GDP, that doesn't mean that's the biggest fall we've seen in decades, but that doesn't mean we're back to eating potatoes in the street. So it's how quickly and concisely can you get across the difference between the newsworthiness of the one-off jump and where that jump leaves us. That's where the game is.
Yeah, I'd also say that, because I think the question there is sort of, if we're reporting on record a jump in excess deaths now, why didn't we in, for example, 2008? I think the news ecosystem is much better for that. So the FT, for example, every time the pound drops against the euro, for example, we'll have a story, because that's what FT readers and a lot of other people want to hear. It's part of the current theme of Britain is a disaster. But it's absurd because it means every few days we have a story about the pound hitting a record low against the euro, and then a few hours later it's back up. And we have this ridiculous thing where we're writing these stories about something that is only true for a fraction of a second, and it only really matters if you're a markets trader, and even there it probably doesn't matter anymore because you've already either made or lost your money. So if we report on a number every time it reaches a new record, when numbers bounce around a lot, I think that's not really helping anyone, and it leads to people thinking, well, why should we care about this? So I think the fact that we're reporting a lot on excess deaths now, despite not having done that for the last 20 years, I don't think means there's some kind of conspiracy that, why weren't we talking about it before, but we are now? Well, it's because now it's a story, and back then it wasn't. Back then it was sort of random fluctuation or smaller fluctuations. Now it's a huge once in a generation, once in a lifetime event.
Yeah. So I thought a lot about how to present this and talk about this because the sort of if you're going by total death registrations, then that it was the highest figure since for England Wales. It was the highest figure since 1918. But if you're looking at, as it were, crude mortality or age standardized mortality, like for age standardized mortality, it was last higher in 2008. And the issue is when you get down to those standardized measures, the issue is then the change. So as in how far does an increase in deaths, as it were, put the clocks back? Because in general, you would think like actually as societies get healthier, treatments get better, there should be an improvement in mortality rates. So you've got something which should be going down year on year since about, I think, 2011. That slowed down, certainly in the United Kingdom, and then this year you just have a massive jump. I have created a graph for this, so I will put that in the chat.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to paraphrase the next one from Denise Levy. Sorry, Denise, but it's a very long question. The gist of it was we need to strike a balance between informing and confusing. And Denise cites the press conference in which Balance and Witty showed that vast number of charts incredibly quickly. And even statisticians would struggle to keep up. And Denise raises the question of, does that kind of thing lower public trust in statistics? People start thinking they're being, blinded with science, kind of thing. So do the speakers think that there has been some risk of loss of public trust at times? And if so, what can be done about it?
I'd say there has. I don't know how much of it comes from an overuse of charts. I think that particular press conference has become sort of infamous, and there were all sorts of reasons, including sort of the aspect ratio on those slides getting chopped off. Certainly for myself, I think there's always a risk of that. I put a lot of charts out on Twitter, but I'm not forcing someone to take all of that in 30 seconds. So yes, I think that was an example of poor statistical communication. But I think the loss of trust in the government over the last year has been for, let's say, qualitative more than quantitative issues. There was the case of the slide showing a scenario which a lot of people took to be a forecast. I think that was an interesting one for, could that have been communicated more effectively? But yeah, I think most of the loss of trust in authority over the last year has come from what people have sort of done or not done, rather than putting a few too many charts in a short span of time.
Okay, next question from Suzanne McGregor, topic which is very dear to my heart as someone who spent a long time, many years ago, literally decades ago.
Can I jump in quickly, sorry, just to respond to another part of the question, which what statisticians can do. Do what Anthony does. Like writing his pieces for the Observer is brilliant, but it's come because he has been in his own free time over the last few years writing just great fact checks that have got picked up and done really well. Contribute to things like the various RSS working groups. Contribute to the Science Media Centre, who do kind of before the headlines briefings for journalists on science stories and the statistics in there. There's loads of ways that people can chip in and help if they really, if they have time to spare. This is work, and are really interested in contributing to public trust in numbers by contributing to the kind of the quality of number-led discourse in society.
Actually, well, that's a really good point. I'm going to jump. Sorry, I'm not going to take the question I was about to take. I will come back to it. But there's a question from Catherine Stewart. Do you think COVID will actually improve data literacy across the general public, or is this just a short-term gain?
I don't know. You kind of think that actually some of the lessons might be, as it were, transferable. So, as in understanding, for instance, that the vaccine efficacy number is an estimate and there's uncertainty around that. You can then transfer that to, say, opinion polling. So people don't go like, oh my god, like Conservatives gone up by 1. Labour have gone up by 2. Let's retweet that kind of thing. I'm yeah, I'm not sure. Like it depends how engaged, as it were, people remain after this, because let's be clear, like the numbers are being used to inform governments, who are then making decisions about, basically whether or not you can go see your own family, and so there's a lot of interest from that aspect of it. I'm not sure.
I think it depends on how we crack on. Like people like David Spiegelhalter, phenomenal coverage throughout the pandemic, as indicative of the appetite for statisticians and for people to communicate the facts in an understandable way. People like Anthony, kind of higher profile now. John's profile is off the charts. I wouldn't be, a year ago, I was not turning up on the news channel, every couple of weeks. So we do see more statisticians and more people really interested in doing data well, acquiring a much higher profile. And it just happens, what happens next? What do we do with that? And how do we get into the next story that comes along?
Yeah, I think there's a little element of a bit of both here, in that some people, and I think we all know the types of people, have probably become more sure in their view that, damn lies and statistics over the last year. And I think most of us on this call would say that's they shouldn't have come to that position. But plenty of people, I think, have felt that statistics are being used with not an agenda, but that, there are certain people presenting this statistic, other people presenting that statistic, certain people including Sweden in their charts, or comparing Sweden to the UK or Sweden to Denmark. And I think there's certainly a lot of people will come away from this thinking, well, statistics, they can just be used for whatever you want. But I think that's still a minority. And I think far more people are the people who have got used to things like checking a government dashboard every day and being comfortable looking at charts and thinking about numbers themselves and looking up data to put things in context. So I think in terms of literacy, it's definitely been a plus. And that's come with a slight downside from people who are probably already that way inclined, who have become a bit more skeptical of the objectivity with which certain stats are used.
Yeah, I think I'm personally sort of quite positive that I think the more people look at this kind of stuff, then there will be some effect. Going back to Suzanne's question, then, it's about the bacon and cancer example about risk. Decades ago, I took quite a bit of money off the Department of Transport for a whole series of surveys trying to work out how they could get the concept of very small risk across to people. And Suzanne's question is, do you have advice on how best to communicate relative risk?
I mean, I put it in context. What's the increase on what?
Yeah.
What's it?
Yeah.
So I think things might have improved from 30 odd years ago, but what we found was this was all about trying to put a value on changing. If you change the risk of dying from a motor accident from 1 in a million to 1 in 10 million or something, what kind of value would people put on that? And we tried all sorts of ways of explaining numbers like that. We had, in the days when Wembley Stadium fitted 100,000 people, we had one person pointed to in Wembley Stadium, and we had one single sugar cube in a 10 by 10 by 10 pack of sugar cubes to try and communicate that risk. And we asked some simple questions about it, and it was clear that the vast majority of people, couldn't understand that risk at all. And it seems to me that the relative risk is one important part, but I think people are just tremendously bad at dealing with enormously high numbers. We don't have no concept of a billion, so how can we cope with 1 in a billion? Can we? Anybody more positive than me about it?
Yeah, there's a problem with vaccines, but we also now have a situation where the relative risk is more important than the absolute risk. So if you look at what's been happening at the risk of dying once you get COVID, or the risk of dying in older age groups, you're seeing fairly consistent relative decreases. And the absolute increases are getting less and less and less and less impressive because the risk is coming down. So that's one situation where I would kind of break the normal rule and say, you must talk about the relative risks in this context, rather than you must talk about the absolute risk, acknowledging, Nick, what you say, that some people, once you go from language of 1 in 100, where people are okay, to 1 in 10,000 or 1 in a million, people start to lose out. I think there's some audience research that the BBC did that suggested that if you go from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 100, or 1 in 400 million compared to 1 in a billion, people use really weird cues like how long it takes to say the word as an indicator. So there are, I'm not saying that's how everybody thinks, but there are some people think there's a good literature on how you do this well. And so I think it's go and read that literature that people like the Winton Centre have produced.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. And again, I think what that touches on there is that whether or not you focus on absolute or relative kind of depends on what the absolute is. Because with COVID, the absolute risk is substantially higher than the absolute risk of a very specific type of blood clot. And so it makes sense to talk about relative risk when the absolute risk is already that high. Whereas when the absolute risk is minuscule, then it makes much more sense to focus on relative.
Okay, this is a more philosophical point, this next question, but it's a very interesting one from, sorry, let me just check who it's from Neil Bendel. How do we balance transparency, legality, and accuracy? There's lots of interest locally in data that local authorities are either unable to share due to conditions under which data is supplied, or which we have concerns with from a reliability perspective. If we don't share data, we're accused of hiding things, but if we do share it, we may be being irresponsible. That's outside your your lines, but it's an interesting question, so I welcome thoughts. Do you feel sometimes you're actually giving, is there information that perhaps you should or shouldn't be giving in terms of how it might impact people?
I think generally not, because organisations like the ONS have good disclosure rules on this stuff and will not disclose things where they shouldn't. So if we think, for example, about COVID cases data at local areas, they're very careful to make sure that we never say there's one case in this MSOA, for example, because that could lead someone to be identified. But I would say, and this is maybe a slight tangent, but I think there is still an attitude in the UK that is a little bit too privacy wary, I would say. I think one thing I've taken from the pandemic over the last year, and again, it's difficult to draw sweeping conclusions, but a lot of the countries whose responses were particularly good are countries where a certain level of surveillance, and it is, surveillance has become a dirty word, but in public health, surveillance has been used for decades, centuries, just to mean knowing what's going on. The countries like Korea and Vietnam and Taiwan have had operations in place where the authorities have been allowed to collect certain data that people in the UK are not comfortable with. And I think there's certainly a question there for us over the last year of does the UK and Europe's attitudes that sort of privacy should come first above all else, does that still hold in situations when you've got a sort of lethal infectious disease spreading? I know, like I said, a bit of a tangent, so I'll see if Robert or Anthony want to answer the actual question.
I think that's very relevant. But
question is ultimately, let's say you have a particular measure, but you're not sure of how robust it is. Like, you can end up in situations where you do a lot of revisions and things like that. And as John says, we have quite sort of strict rules about disclosure. So I think that it is a really difficult balance, and it's particularly true for local authorities where identification can happen. And it's about, I think it's about being forward and communicating that's why you're not providing that, that data, which some people might want, as in, like COVID cases by ward or something. That actually is because it's too small of a unit, you might identify people. Don't know if you have any more to add, Rob.
No, not particularly. I think there were questions about speed of data sharing within government in the summer, but with the public or publicly facing stuff, you got to go slow because trust is easy to lose and not easy to get back.
Good point. Yeah. There's a question from Jonathan Laszlo, which I think this is addressed to Robert and John in your roles as journalists rather than your role as statisticians. Working for the ONS, I'm very conscious that we are not journalists, nor should we be. But that being said, we do want publications data to be picked up as widely and accurately as possible by journalists. what can we and others publishing official data and so on do to facilitate that process and make your jobs easier? Robert.
No, okay. Look, there's a good practice team at the ONS who are very helpful with folks who are trying to do this. I've come and given a few talks a few times. The main things I would ask for from the ONS are planning works on diary. So with about 2 or 3 days to go, maybe 1 day to go, all the teams in the BBC at least will look at what's coming up tomorrow. And our best understanding of what's in the release tomorrow will be the stuff that goes on the ONS website. And that frequently says, for example, in a release entitled Vaccination Rates by Ethnicity, we'll have very helpful information like, this is a study that describes vaccination rates by ethnicity. Whereas if the blurb that went beforehand told you not what's in the analysis, I know pre-release access prevents that, but the questions that the analysis will be asking without hinting at the answers, that enables people to prepare in advance to think how strong the story might be, to do any, prereqs for filming that they might need to do if you're going to get on the telly, to line up guests and things like that. So good, available, early information. The next thing I'd say is when you're sharing the information on the day, make it simple. I know the ONS has moved to doing kind of bundled releases, so the labour market is in 4 different sections. That's difficult. I would go so far as to say it can be a real pain to navigate, particularly if you're filing in 3 minutes' time. And an even more of a pain if the overview is not at the top of the list of 4 pages that are in the release. So, there are some simple logistical things that you can do to make the releases. And then when you write it, just that presentation I gave, just think about, what are the main caveats? What is the top story that's coming out of this release? Don't reorganize everything around it, but address it. The statisticians quote in ONS releases is a great way to focus people's attentions on the main things that you want to take away. It doesn't necessarily require you restructuring a release completely. So there are ways to do it really well.
Yeah, I agree with everything Robert said there. I think just the things I'd add are mainly positives for the ONS, which is I think of the organisations that have come out of the last year with an enhanced reputation, I think the ONS is absolutely up there, along with places like Public Health England. And having worked with a lot of data from other countries around the world, they're far inferior to the ONS in many, many ways, but a big one of which is that notwithstanding the comments Robert makes about maybe slight restructuring of the publications, the fact that the ONS does now publish a written through sort of narrative discussion of what something shows is far way beyond what a lot of countries do, where it will just be sort of, here's the data, and maybe here's sort of some extremely jargon-filled sort of scientific abstract style description of what's going on. So I think the ONS has come on leaps and bounds in the last 5 or 10 years. And yeah, if we can get these additional improvements at the margins, that would be fantastic as well. But I think we'll allow some back patting in the meantime.
100% minor gripes do not detract from the phenomenal year. I was wrong not to start with that, John.
I've got a couple of related questions from Paul Allen and Christine DeLong to sort of do with the relative balance between sort of data viz as a simple way of presenting things, or the headline as a simple way of presenting things, and then all of the reference tables, the detailed longer articles that go behind it. And Christine raised particularly the point of what data might actually make that headline change. Here's the headline, this is where we are, but some kind of discussion of under what circumstances might things change. Are there ways in which we might, are we getting that balance right, or could we improve that balance?
I think Robert might have been on broadcasting when I mentioned this earlier, but Robert, you talked about the question of whether the UK had the highest excess deaths total, and the fact that we at the FT went with that line a bit earlier. And I was saying that ironically, the result of that was that Spain then, in a matter of minutes after we filed, they revised their death count upwards, and we had to hastily change it from worst to second worst. So I think that for us at the FT was an example of, if your headline is so heavily reliant on one number, which is subject to hourly change, then maybe we shouldn't have gone with that headline when we did. I think again that's a good general rule. We shouldn't be. It's the wrong way to do journalism, to just sort of have the thing you already believe and then wait for things to fall into place and then say, oh, now we can say it. That's not how any of this should work. So I think just, making sure that your headlines and stories are based on a body of work, a body of evidence, and they speak not just to a sort of a number that is true at one point in time, but they speak to a phenomenon and an actual, an observable thing where the number is just sort of one part of the evidence.
Anthony, something's right up your street.
Yeah. So certainly for us, I don't think graphs can do everything. Sometimes a table is kind of the best way of presenting something. Sometimes, yes, you do need to get properly involved and write, sound quite long in order to explain things. On that question about like headlines, it's kind of you do need to make sure, as it were, what headline you're writing is sort of robust to sort of small changes, because the revisions that may happen after publication, because otherwise you end up in a situation where it's like pound hits new low, and then of course that's only true for possibly a matter of minutes.
Robert, anything to add to that? No, fine. Just before I forget, I should say, for those of you, if you haven't been looking at the chat as it goes along, there's, as well as questions, there's been a couple of very interesting points pasted and a couple of links to interesting things. One of them by Anthony. So I would urge you to have a look at those, because there's stuff that isn't questions but is informative. What is a question is from Simon Briscoe. Is it wrong to present underlying death international comparisons quite so often, given so many countries don't have the data, and similarly numbers of positive tests, given all countries have different regimes for testing?
I'd say yes and yes, it is irresponsible at least to just do that without giving it any thought. A frequent topic of frustration within the FT is when one of our an international correspondent or something will say like, oh, can you just send us the latest data on COVID deaths, because we're writing about, for example, a recent one, we're writing about how the Czech Republic has now got the highest number of confirmed, or highest rate of confirmed deaths anywhere in the world. And I'm thinking, well, we can do that, yes, but we also are one of the organizations, along with the BBC and The Economist and others, who have data on excess deaths, which shows that it's extraordinarily unlikely that the Czech Republic has the highest actual pandemic death toll in the world. And it's this constant tension between the easier availability of these theoretically apples to apples, but in reality absolutely not apples to apples, comparisons of cases and deaths, versus the harder to get but much more sort of intellectually honest examples of things like excess deaths. And on cases it's similar. There's obviously a lot of attention on India at the moment and the situation there, and we know that for many reasons testing in India is far more sparse than it is in Europe and the US, and same with Mexico. A lot of these countries that will end up with some of the worst outcomes from the last year and indeed for the coming year are the ones who have the worst data, and those things are not unrelated either. So I think, and I speak here as someone who was doing this every day last March and April, so I accept some responsibility for sort of establishing this as a pattern that people have got into. But it's absolutely a problem, and I now find myself sort of fighting fires that I probably started a year ago in terms of telling people, no, you can't just keep saying the UK has had the worst death toll from COVID, because it hasn't. And you can't keep just using the numbers that are most supportive of that narrative when we know we have better numbers out there. So it's a tricky one, and it's a problem that I've probably helped sort of catalyze at least.
It's difficult because you get variations in definitions within nations. Like here, our lead measure we used to have basically three. So England had its own measure, Scotland, Northern Ireland were aligned, and then Wales has something different. Now, Public Health England's lead measure is aligned to Scotland, Northern Ireland on positive testing. Like you can have situations where there's not actually a standardised say for PCR testing. So you can have samples going to different laboratories and ending up with coming back reporting different results. And as I pointed out in my presentation, there's a lot of different definitions out there, like particularly for COVID-19 deaths, and you end up with some countries which essentially report an aggregated figure like the UK does, and also the United States, where some states will include probable deaths in their death counts and others won't.
Robert, do you have guidelines for dealing with this at the Beeb?
Well, the comparisons are going to happen, right? As John says, people want to look at those numbers, and it's how effectively can you make the, as John describes it, the more intellectually honest figures that you have, or the caveats, how can you make them grabby or available? How can you get those into the story? That's what it's about. So I don't think it's irresponsible to report on those numbers. It's irresponsible to report on them irresponsibly. So it's like kind of a circular answer.
Yeah. Well said. I'm going to forgive John for raising the very sore point of India, where I should have been last May, which was postponed to this May, which is now going to be postponed again until the May 2022. And move on to a question from Robert Whitehead about something I think which is probably more behavioural than anything else. Do the speakers follow the Oxford Lockdown Stringency Index? And if they do, how do you rate it as an analytical tool? Is it possible to quantify very different social policies in very different countries? John obviously does follow it.
Yeah, I'd say it's a great initiative. I think the fact that we have people out there trying to track all different aspects of the pandemic is incredibly useful. And I'd say the same thing for things like the Google mobility data. The fact that we have data not only on the outcomes, but sort of the context in which they're happening is obviously absolutely invaluable for people who are trying to work out in real time what does and doesn't work here. I think the tricky thing, and this is not a criticism of the data that the Oxford team have put together, but there's the difference between policies and their impacts, and the fact that two countries have the same policies in terms of mask wearing or lack of mask wearing, as another example, doesn't mean that that's how people act. The most recent case where this has come up is the hot topic of Florida in the US, which is sort of becoming the US is Sweden in terms of being used as a sort of political football by different sides. And the restrictions in Florida have been relatively lax, but people's actions in large parts of the state have been not dissimilar to places that have much more restrictions in place. So I think the tricky thing with data on what governments are doing is, well, are the people taking that on board? Latin America is another example where a place like Ecuador had, and Peru, they both had strict and early lockdowns, but because of other, structural issues that face Peru and Ecuador that don't face, the UK and France and Italy, people weren't able to adhere to those lockdowns in the way that we've been able to here. So I think that data is really useful to have, but the risk is reading too much into whether a measure is actually acted upon by everyone.
Anyone else want to add to that?
No, that's great. Oh, they don't have Scotland. They don't go below the UK. Naughty.
Okay, we have one very long final question from the question from Catherine Stewart elicited answers that tend to fragment the audience into enthusiasts who can and will transfer their learning about general statistic concepts, and skeptics whose mistrust may have deepened. Do the media have anything they can do to win over the skeptics?
I'd say yes, which is I'd point to some of the sort of techniques and approaches that I tried to include in my slides, which is that we need to be communicators more than broadcasters. And that's not a dig at Robert. This needs to be a conversation more than it is a one-way thing, because a lot of, there are some skeptics who are, capital S sort of hat wearing skeptics, but a lot of people just have genuine questions. And the result of that is some of them are, let's say, more vulnerable to being led astray. But there are a lot of people who just have questions and they want someone to address their questions. And in a lot of cases, there are simple, clear, and accessible answers that would address their concerns. There are people who are, this has been a crazy year, and there are people who are worried and concerned. And if people took the time to say, look, you've heard this, you've seen this, but you don't need to worry about it, and here's why, that would do a load of good. And I think the problem at the moment is the conversations we have with readers and viewers and listeners, when we have them at all, are brief and often one-directional, and that allows people to go away from that thinking, I don't know what to think here. And so I think getting people into a space where we can have more conversations is the way to combat that, really.
Yeah. Bang on. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, I think that's a really, really good way to finish. We've come to the end of our allotted time. It's been a great success. We had 150 people booked, and 115 I think actually came along, which is a very high ratio of actual attendance ratio. And 2/3 of them are still here at the very, very end, which again is a very good indicator of how useful a session it was, because I can tell you that it's not normally that good. So thanks to the three of you for not just for 3 excellent presentations, but for maintaining a really good discussion. And thanks to you for those of you who did ask questions. I hope you all found it as useful as I did. And as I say, the recording will be available on the RSS website in the not too distant. So thank you all very much for coming along, and I will bid you farewell.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.